Thank you very much. I might fear nearly that my reputation precedes me, as I'm already for the third time asked to stick to 25-30 minutes. I will do my best. Very good morning to all of you. Thanks a lot for having me and for inviting me. Philipp Schulmeister, I'm Austrian and working for 20 years now in the European Parliament in Brussels. I'm now the head of the Public Opinion Monitoring Unit. We're doing two things. The one is, which you might be familiar with, a regular series of so-called Eurobarometer studies. We are doing them in parallel with the European Commission. They have their series and their studies, and we do ours, which are clearly focused a little bit more, or much more, on the European Parliament and parliamentary topics. And now, the closer we're coming to the European elections, also on the election process, on voting behavior, voting motivation, topics, campaign issues, you name it. That's the one thing. The second thing that we're dealing with is we're continuously monitoring political developments in all the 27, 28 member states with the aim of coming up with a more or less reliable and robust projection for the outcome of the European elections. So, and these are exactly more or less the two topics I would like to talk to you about today. On the one hand, in the beginning, I want to give you a brief overview of how we see from our Eurobarometer work and from the data that we have at our disposal, how we see the current public opinion climate as to the European Union, to the European elections. Let's say a little bit to paraphrase an old Western, the good, the bad, and the ugly. On the one hand. Second, what does this mean then in terms for a parliamentary institutional election campaign? What do we want to do? What do we want to achieve? Whom do we want to talk to? And the third point, which might, I hope, also be interesting to you, is from the data that we have at our disposal now, how could the next European Parliament look like? What would be possible majorities? Where are the trends going? Where are difficulties that we could see for future majority finding in the European Parliament? So if that's okay with you, let's get started with Eurobarometer data. As I said, I tried to group this very briefly in three clusters, the positive indicators that we're having at the beginning. There is, from the data we have at our disposal, a clear high and rising support for the European Union in some fundamental indicators, and also at the same time for more European intervention, at least in the key areas that citizens would express as their priority topics in their country and for the European Union. And with that, let's say, distinction in their country and the European Union, that's already a first hint at where I'm going at the end of the day, because looking at both the campaign and policy making only from a Brussels bubble perspective doesn't make any sense at all, at least when we're looking at the data. And the second that I'm looking at is also a possible, as a positive aspect, a possible time dividend due to age cohort effects. In other words, more simply put, we see the younger respondents are, the more positive their attitudes towards the European Union. So this might be something that might impact over time. If we're looking at that first indicator, classic standard question we're asking, do you think your country has benefited from being a member of the European Union? In our last survey in October, that was the Eurobarometer 90.2, we had the European average result of 68%, nearly 7 in 10 Europeans believing that their country has benefited from being a member of the European Union. Now, this is something that communication people in the Parliament, starting from, well, my own shop, to also the political groups, would take and communicate on it as such. 68%, yay. I think that figure and every graphic that you could do out of it is a little bit like cat content on Facebook. It's nice, it's fluffy, it gives you a good feeling, it doesn't tell you anything. And you click it away afterwards because you can't work with it. It's much more interesting if we look, of course, at the distribution spread throughout the 27, 28 member countries. And we will see immediately that there is, and again, let's not try to decipher the graph as it's more like a visualization of what I try to tell you. There is a huge spread throughout, starting from Ireland, where 92% would say my country has benefited from being a member of the European Union, down to, unfortunately, right now Italy, where we are with, it's Greece down there, yeah? Where we say 54% we have benefited from being a member of the European Union. So there is a huge spread.
It's missing Italy.
No, I don't think that Italy is missing. I think that Italy is actually really at the bottom of it, and I unfortunately cut it off. In the meantime, with this graph, I'm unfortunately pretty confident, and Italy is missing at the bottom. I'm sorry, we're looking at 45% of Italian people who say that my country has benefited currently from being a member of the European Union. So, that's the first. We need to observe the country differences. The second one, the age dividend, if you want. Young and European is something that holds true throughout most of the European member states. But, there is a clear but to that one. Let's look at the age breakdown, if you want. On the left, let's start with the question, EU membership is a good thing. 68% of the age cohort of 15 to 24 say, yes, that's true for me, EU membership is a good thing. And then it goes downward to 57% if you want to the 55 plus. But let's look at all the other questions that we have analyzed in this context for the age. Interest in the European elections. Voting in the European elections is high importance. Likelihood to vote in the next European elections, knowledge of the date. And you see more or less a clear turnaround, a clear inversion of the results. The younger, the less interest to go to vote, the less importance given to voting, the less likelihood to vote, the less knowledge about the date. So that is, while being a positive thing, the younger, the more interested in Europe. At the same time, and if we are looking just at one of the most recent results, Brexit referendum 2016 in the UK, and you see which age cohort mostly stayed at home at that point in time, then you see this is something that is also of a huge importance for a European election campaign, also run by the European Parliament. The second one, if we want to look at, let's say, the limitations and the warnings. What does the data tell us about what indicators are more like a yellow light and more like warning signs that we need to heed? The first is the trust issue. 42% of respondents in our Eurobarometer survey, in the last one, tend to trust the European Union. So there is a clear majority of distrust in the European Union. And if we're looking, and that's from a recent so-called regional Eurobarometer that the European Commission did, where we are actually breaking down, and you might know the normal standard sample size for a Eurobarometer survey is 27,000 face-to-face interviews, so that's roughly a sample of 1,000 per member state. The regional surveys, they are only doing this every 3 years, is tripling this number, which allows us to break down the data really on a regional basis. These two graphs, on the left one would be trust in the European Union, and on the right one would be trust in the national government. I don't need to go too much into the, let's say, into the graph or into the data for you to see that in most of the countries, the trust in the European Union seems, at least from this data set, seems to be higher than the trust in the national institutions, in the national government. So, while this, let's say, for our point of view, for an institutional point of view, is something positive, still the overall trust in public institutions, in parliaments, governments, politicians, is rather low and on a permanent decline over the last years. The diversity issue, or the united by diversity, this would be something that is normally said as one of the strong points of the European Union. We are so strong because we have this richness of all the different regions and cultures and countries and where we come from. This makes up, this multicolored pattern makes up what we are and why we are so special. Yes, on the one hand, but on the other hand, it becomes a difficulty, as we can see, for policy making. It becomes also a difficulty at the end of the day, or in more practical terms, for campaigning, when we talk about an institutional about an institutional campaign. So it was quite interesting for me now listening to the three, okay, there were three, four European political party representatives and saying what they, listening to what they were saying about the topics. This is quite in line with what we have on campaign topics for the European elections. So we asked the questions in 2017, 2018, 3 times in a row. What would be the key topics you would like to hear about in the European election campaign for the next year, for the next 1.5 years, the next 6 months? The European aggregation, the European average numbers are pretty clear. Immigration, economy and growth, combating youth unemployment, fight against terrorism, and combating climate change as a 5th one. That's pretty clear. There is also not that much of a change over time if we're looking at the last 2, 3, 4 years and compare it, if you want, with legislation priority topics where we also ask for preferences of citizens where they want the parliament to do more in terms of legislation. So that is pretty clear. But looking at European average figures is, in my view, quite deceiving because it completely hides, sorry, that was the wrong button. There we go. It hides the significant differences in choice and also salience on the different topics when we look at no matter which of the European Union countries in detail. Just 5 picked at random. So we had immigration, economy and growth, and youth and unemployment as, let's say, European average topics.
About the colors, which is immigration?
Immigration would be the dark blue.
Economy and?
This is economy and growth. And the last one would be combating youth unemployment. So the dark blue is immigration, the green is economy and growth, and the light blue would be youth unemployment. And the setup throughout the different countries, is very, very much different. Netherlands, for
what about we don't see anything.
Yeah.
The 2 countries on the bottom.
So let's say, for example, let's start with
the 2 countries on the bottom.
Okay, wait. Okay, that's France.
Sweden.
Okay.
Okay.
France and Sweden. Okay, that's even, that's the best way to project.
No, France and Sweden. So Netherlands, we would have climate change as the first one. The way the European Union should be working in the future, and human rights and democracy as the third point. Just again, as a visualization, the topics are very, very different from country to country. The interest expressed in these topics is very much different from country to country. I mean, if we're looking at Italy, for example, more or less, not by chance, there is a reason for that. The choice of topics in Italy is the same. It's immigration, economy and growth, and youth unemployment. Same as in the European Union on the average, but with a far higher interest expressed on that one, with above 70% with the topic of immigration, and likewise higher 62 and 59% for the 2 other topics. So that's the next very important thing for us to consider in setting up our campaign. And the third one would be also the variance, if you want, per topic compared on the whole European, throughout the member states. Climate change, we have a variance of 57 percentage points between Bulgaria, who ranked this topic first by only 18%, and Sweden with 75%. Combating youth unemployment, the same goes from Czech 20% and Greece 76%. And you can go through it, through all the different topics, and you would see similar results at the end of the day. What does this mean for us? It means for us, on the one hand, that a European campaign that works top-down, that works with only 4 topics, regardless of the situation on the ground, will, in our opinion, will not work. Because you risk of catching by far not all the people that you would like to reach out to. You risk to a very high degree of missing what they're really interested in, and that all brings it then back down, if you want, to, in my view, relatively simple communication principle. Why should you be interested in what I'm telling you if I don't take care in what I'm talking about, that this is what matters to you? So basically, if I'm not touching upon the subjects and the issues that you care about, then I will have not really a chance to successfully communicate with you. This is something that possibly over the past years, the Brussels bubble, if you want, Brussels as a chiffre, has neglected to a certain degree, which is also why we have certain political tendencies over the past years that do far better on that degree. I'm actually quite surprised by the way, on the one hand it's telling, and on the other hand it's a little bit surprising how the guy from the Europe des Nations, so the right-wing group in the European Parliament, was so weak on topics and so weak on what they want to talk about. That was, but if you look, the ALDE group was talking about migration. That's that, to offer European solutions. Yes, migration is a key topic, that's clear, both in most of the countries and on the European average, but it's not the only topic. So to make this a single issue campaign, combined with we fight against something, so actually a little bit the lack of an own position, if you want. I'm very curious whether they will be able to offer a European solution, because that would a little bit like squaring the circle. But let's see where they get it. The EPP is already a little bit more distributed: migration, economy and growth, and climate change. So they are indeed, as all of the political groups and parties are doing, they are profiting from the data that we are giving to them, and they are working with that one. So they are already breaking it down a little bit more. The S&D, in my view, was, if I may say this frankly, was the weakest on that. This was absolutely, I'm very undiplomatic mostly. It was absolutely cloud cuckoo and nearly no connection to actual problems citizens can connect to from the language that he used, from the way that he described these topics. This was very theoretical to a certain point, and I'm not sure that this will do them good at the end of the day. One another key point is, and we saw that already before with the age breakdown for the young age group, pro-European attitudes do not automatically translate into pro-European preferences. In other words, just because you think that the European Union is a good thing, left side of the graph, doesn't mean that you're interested in the European elections or actually will go and vote. There is no correlation in any country between I'm interested and I will go to vote at the end of the day. Attitudes do not transfer automatically into preferences or into votes. Final point, the rather negative information we get out of the data. Crisis is becoming a continued narrative throughout the European Union, namely a single larger European Union member state that didn't have crisis in its newspaper media headlines over the last years, be it domestic, European, international, you name it, starting from Brexit. The crisis narrative is continuously hanging on. The next thing that we are seeing clearly centrifugal forces in key policy areas. We can start with migration, but we can also talk and have a look at economic policies and fiscal policies. Nearly everything you see that it becomes more and more difficult to come to a European uniform or homogeneous approach on solutions, on policy solutions, and that might be one of the key challenges for the next 5 years when it comes to legislation. the anti-establishment forces. In April 2018, so in the spring survey, we asked the question on the emergence of new political parties, new political protest movements, anti-establishment movements, with 4 statements where we asked them whether they would support them or not. 70% of citizens of the respondents said just being against something does not improve anything. So far, so good. But 56% said we need a real change, and this is what these parties and movements can bring. So there is an appetite for trying out something new. There is this, combined with the distrust in established political institutions, politicians, parliaments, etc. There is an appetite in looking for new solutions. New political parties and movements can find solutions better, 53%, as opposed to, on the other side, 50% saying this development is not a threat to our democracy. So it's an ambivalent picture, if you want. It's, they want clearly something done. Just talking will not help. But there is a certain hope that new parties might bring real change, might find new solutions better, and citizens don't necessarily see it as a threat to democracy. There's another slide that I just briefly want to touch upon. Pew Research did in spring 2017 its global attitude survey, asking, among other questions, also how committed you are to representative democracy. And from what we can see from that one is, or at least what we have to ask ourselves, is representative democracy in Europe, in the European Union, really the one and only solution, and nothing is going to change about that ever 50 years after World War II, etc., etc. And the data suggests, at least, that there is a growing number of citizens that would be not 100% committed to representative democracy. This indicator in the green one, the less committed, that would combine, could you imagine, from the question, could you imagine next to representative democracy also an expert, a direct democracy, an expert government, a strong man solution, or even a military government? So if the respondents would pick out at least one of these 3 options next to representative democracy, they would fall into this category. So it's a warning sign, as we would interpret it for the time being. So that brings us then to the European elections. So we have fundamental positive indicators when it comes to support for the European Union. We have the distrust situation. We have the situation that especially the most pro-European target groups would be the most reluctant to actually go to vote. And we have a clear and present distribution of topics, of interests, of issues throughout the 27 member states and throughout the social demographic if you go down. What does this mean for us? It means for us, and the next point that I quickly want to say is, European Parliament institutional campaign is at best a third battle line in the campaign for the European elections. As much as we would like to have true European elections fought on true European topics, possibly even with a true European list where you can vote a candidate on the candidate or on the Spitzenkandidat, if you want, where everyone could be able to vote for the next president of the European Commission as the lead candidate for the political list. As much as we would like that, the reality on the ground is very much different. We're talking about 27, 28 national elections, mostly driven by national topics or by a national interpretation of the topic. That being said, next thing, the first battle line therefore is and will always remain national parties and the national candidates. Those are the ones who will fight the election on the ground, who will fight the campaign on the ground themselves. Expressed, for example, by the ENF representative, but also by Darren Murphy for the EPP. We want our candidates to propose their ideas to their voters on the ground. The second line, then, European political parties, if you wanted. The third line, would be the European Parliament or the institutional campaigns. Now, if we're thinking about, in this setup, what could be, in our view, or what could be the only, possible success factor for a European Parliament campaign, then it can only be turnout. Because we cannot go too much into topics, we cannot go too much into ideology, into issues. We have to work on turnout. I think if we're looking at turnout, just as a brief comparison, because that's quite often done with presidential elections and midterm elections in the United States. You all know there is a continuous decline in turnout for the European elections since 1979, where we had roughly 62%, and now in 2014 we ended up at 42.6%. It's quite interesting to observe the significant increase of turnout in the last midterm elections in the US. I wonder whether the polarization is actually doing something here to increase the turnout, and whether this is something that we might possibly see also with the next European elections. We have to take a close look, of course, also on the rise of the anti-European votes across the EU27. This is data collected both from the Chapel Hill expert survey and from our own sources, where we can see that in pink, if you want, the somewhat opposed anti-European parties rose to something about 26-27% of the vote share, and the strongly opposed to 17% of the vote share. The shrinking middle ground. Let's look at the political forces in the European Parliament since 1999. And you can see that in our projections for 2019, EPP and S&D will fall, and this is, in my view, pretty irreversible now, will fall below the 50% majority line. And the aggregation of right-wing groups, of which we have 3 for the time being, will settle on a second position, more or less. Just briefly, the picture for Italy, over time, this time from 1979 to where we are in the projections right now. It is a similar and yet nevertheless completely more excessive picture, if you want. Trend lines for the political groups. The blue on the top is the EPP. Let's try not to blend in with the laser. The blue on the top is the EPP. Over our observation period over the last 2 years, they are remaining more or less with a slightly declining trend, remaining more or less stable. Red, Social Democrats. Let's see how they will do, but I think they will be lucky to keep the second position. Third one is the Liberals. They got a boost around here when we added Macron and the French possibly into their group, but since then also I would rather have a negative trend since that time. Down here we have the 3 right-wing groups, so the ECR, currently British Polish Law and Justice and British Tories, the EFDD, where among others UKIP with Farage is sitting in, but also Cinque Stelle, and then you have the ENF, which would be, for example, Le Pen, but also La Lega and other parties. This one is the aggregated seat potential for all the right-wing politicians or seats that we might get in the next European Parliament. I've looked at that before, so the main thing that we are seeing that there is no clear majority in the next European Parliament. There is no stable center-right majority, there is no stable center-left or even left majority. There is only a majority to be found across the middle, meaning EPP, S&D, possibly the Liberals and the Greens also. Okay, due to time issues, okay, that's maybe the last interesting point if we want to look at. It is always said that at European elections, opposition parties are doing better than government parties. I would subscribe to that with the added factor that we need to take in. Where are the European elections placed in the overall national election cycle? If European elections are taking place in the middle of a national election cycle, indeed government parties would do less well, opposition parties would do better. If the last national elections were closely before the European elections, government parties would relatively do better. See the same here on the other side with the opposition parties. If we have the European elections in the middle of the national cycle, opposition parties are doing better. If they are close to the last national elections, opposition parties will do worse, at least in our projections. And that's about it. Quickly click through that one. That's the majority, again, the majority possibilities, and I'm done. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.